In this session, we discuss Carmen's development and use of workbooks to promote socio-emotional attunement for both therapists and clients, and a challenging case story. Welcome to the second season of the AFTA podcast. I am Naveed Zamani and I am your host. In this session, I'm excited to welcome back and be speaking with Dr. Carmen Knudson-Martin. Dr. Carmen Knudson-Martin, PhD, LMFD, is Professor Emerita of Marital, Couple, and Family Therapy Program at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. She has published over 100 articles and book chapters on the influence of the larger sociocultural context in couple and family relationships and the political and ethical implications of therapist actions on marital equality, relational development, and couple therapy. She is a developer of socio-emotional relationship therapy, which addresses the microprocesses by which societal power processes play out in couple relationships. Carmen has published 2 recent books: The Socio-Emotional Relationship Workbook for Couples, Closing the Gap Between the Relationship You Want and the Relationship You Have, and A Step-by-Step Guide to Socio-Emotional Relationship Therapy, a socially responsible approach to clinical practice. Thanks again, Carmen, for joining us.
My pleasure.
So this round, I'm asking interviewees for a story about a time in their clinical practice that they felt that they failed, and what did you learn? And so you can kind of launch off that question wherever it makes sense for you.
Okay. Well, I certainly can give a story about clinical practice, but what resonates most with me is what I experienced in writing a workbook for couples. And so I thought maybe we could start our conversation there. In the way that I have always approached therapy, I have been very concerned, as you know, about power in all the different ways that it can come into the work that we do. So one way is how it affects clients' perceptions of themselves and their relationships, but another is what it means for how we engage with clients. So I have tried to avoid a prescriptive role. In the model of therapy that I developed with a number of colleagues, we used the circle of care as a sort of concrete set of ways to orient to each other for clients, but we were very careful to think about these and conceptualize them and present them not as a set of skills that we were teaching, but as a way of orienting that's sort of underlies what's necessary for people to mutually support each other in their relationships. So when I got an invitation to write a workbook, I have never used such things in my clinical practice.
And this is a workbook for clients, right?
This is a workbook for clients. This other book has a similar conundrum in a way because it says a step-by-step guide to clinical practice. So that's the one for the clinicians. But right now I'm talking about, it's a workbook for couples. And to write it, which turned out to be a really, I think, positive and helpful contribution to the field, but I had to be willing to be very definitive in saying, especially in the chapters that are specifically about, there's a chapter about vulnerability, for example. How can partners become have shared vulnerability? And I make declarative statements that vulnerability is necessary for partners to feel safe with each other and for each person to express things. I end up giving kind of step by step here, do this first, do this second. And so it really forced me to think about the role of the therapist, or the role of not being an advice giver. Now, the plus side is, you, as a therapist, you can give clients the workbook and have them do it. And then you could talk about it in therapy and what they think and what works for them and what doesn't work for them. But what I discovered in pushing myself beyond my comfort level in giving, at least in some of the chapters, such concrete advice, is that I think it's really helpful.
Mm.
My work had been predicated in early research with couples that found that they would have egalitarian ideals, and they'd want relationships, but then when we asked them questions about what actually happened in their relationship, they didn't really have a model for what that would look like in practice. And so the workbook, in essence, provides a model that's missing in our larger societal discourse about, well, how do people really engage with each other in a mutually supportive way? And then other chapters really help people reflect on their relational values and their social, I called it your place in the world, your social locations, and how that plays in. So those are more reflective. And so in terms of being a failure, it's not as much as being a failure, but having to let go of what's been such an important piece to me, which is to be responsible for what I contribute to therapy and the kind of values that I'm reinforcing and how I engage to interrupt power. To write a guide for couples or anybody who's interested in relationships in their lives, where I had to take a much more knowing perspective as opposed to maybe a facilitating perspective.
Right. Yeah, let me just make sure I'm capturing some of this, because I am really fascinated knowing some of your work in history, Carmen, that you're at this stage that you're doing this incredible tightrope walk of kind of honoring a history or perhaps a set of ethics around being cautious of advice giving and being prescriptive, but also taking on this challenge of how to kind of craft a workbook or some perhaps model of what an egalitarian relationship actually looks like. Because I don't know about your experience, but it's definitely mine that folks show up to therapy very articulate about the problem and the problem story and all the things that are going wrong. But to imagine the opposite, or like what works, is very challenging. So in some ways, you're kind of offering perhaps a path that folks could kind of consider. Am I kind of capturing some of that correctly?
Yes, well, and in therapy, I might introduce a question about, or an observation about how they could do this more mutually. I might help them recognize how there's an imbalance in maybe who's attending to each other. But I would do it in a way where I'm helping them, and I'm bringing something to the conversation that helps them envision a more. So I'm owning that even in therapy, I'm bringing something. There is no way not to do that,
Right.
really, unless I'm just allowing the dominant discourses to guide everything that we do. But in the workbook, it is. I think it's still presented in a pretty reflective way, but it is at least, especially in certain chapters, it is kind of a set of instructions to suggest that they do this, and to suggest, 4 steps to how to have a conversation, or something like that.
Right.
And that is not the sort of work that I would typically have done in a clinical setting.
All right. I want to ask you about how you've kind of landed here because as you're sharing, I have to admit I'm kind of in my own stories and histories. One being that as someone who was trained in the narrative therapy kind of approach, I remember especially earlier days when I was first kind of like getting my feet wet with some of Michael White's reading and your reading as well, your writing as well, Carmen, and yeah, just kind of exploring the world of narrative. I found myself in contexts, especially in couples counseling, where I was perhaps interpreting the decentered approach a bit differently. As I understand it now, decentered is more about knowledge, but I think I kind of taken it on as decentered to be collaborative is to be decentered in terms of the process or the facilitation as well. And my own failures, I quickly taught me that actually in structure is pretty important and helpful in couples and family counseling and any kind of relational engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's where my head goes, but I guess I'm curious if I could ask you, Carmen, like what what has drawn you into taking on this task, especially when it's pushing you to kind of the edges of what you would typically be doing or clinically perhaps accustomed to?
Well, I would keep getting questions about what resources were available. Um, First of all, I was invited to do it. I mean, I probably wouldn't have made the proposal on my own,
Mm,
but a publisher reached out to me. Turned out I didn't actually go with that publisher. I went with Routledge, who published also the Guide for Clinicians. Um, and it's a similar issue with the Guide for Clinicians in that just the title itself, a step-by-step guide. I think of therapy as a more creative process. I don't come down on the as far on the collaborative side as like Harlene Anderson's work to say that we should have no model at all. Obviously, I have a model, um, but I've been very careful about you talked about straddling that line between being intentional about what I'm bringing to the therapy and being always questioning um, the limits of what might be missing if I bring this. What might be important to clients that I'm missing, and so I've always thought about therapy as as truly a collaborative process where the client's story as they tell it. There's a chapter in the clinician's guide, the step-by-step guide, where really talk about how what the story clients tell depends on the questions we ask.
mm,
So it's acknowledging that from the get-go, this is not a neutral process, and that it isn't just listening to the client's story because there's, you know, different therapists may privilege clients' voices in different ways,
right.
but to think of that as a neutral process or that therapists' voices aren't in some way structuring that process to me is not an accurate representation of what can possibly happen. So when I do a book, one for clinicians and one for couples themselves, that sets out steps and says, try this, do this, here's what works best. And it's coming out of my experience, like what you said for yourself, that therapists really do need to provide structure. I've learned from this writing the book, because I think it's very helpful. I tell people I wish I would have had this 20 years ago. I think people do need some structure.
Mm,
I think there's choices about how we can invite people to engage with it. I always invite clinicians to engage with what I'm presenting and make it their own. And you know, take. I'm not suggesting that everybody should do things exactly as I suggest, but what I'm coming to understand is that clients can, how much clients can benefit um, from some more concrete worksheet kinds of things. I ended up making worksheets because one of the reviewers of the book proposal suggested that. And when I started doing that, um, here's a place to log your what happened and to think about the social discourses that were influencing you and how it affected your partner, or how the emotions that you're feeling are are coming up, and what are the uh, different societal contexts that are influencing those, and what does it say about you as a person. I can see how valuable these are from a social justice perspective in offering clients something different than the highly individualistic models that are out there, and even all the many good couple therapy, or guides for couples that help them communicate better and maybe reflect on themselves to some extent. But I could find none that centralized the ideas of power disparities,
Mm.
where those might come from, how the larger societal discourse shapes the way we interact with each other. And so, in a sense, I guess I learned that I had to be willing to play the game, so to speak, in the way that people seek help. And one of those ways is by looking for models through workbooks, through texts, through podcasts like what you're doing now. Um, so at this moment, I'm not seeing any clients. I don't have a private practice, and I'm not. I used to see people at our training clinic and such. So I still do supervision and such. But um, if I were seeing clients right now, I would be more comfortable giving them. I would use the workbook. I could imagine having couples groups organized around the book, and then bringing in their responses to it, helping them reflect on it. And that would be quite a shift for me, because I never did that. I don't know about you, but I never did that kind of therapy. I didn't give people a worksheet and say, take this home and do it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't, and I haven't, but I'm not against it. I think to your point, or at least how I'm interpreting your point, Carmen, and you can hold me accountable, is that just because I'm not one to approach a problem like that doesn't mean that others aren't, and that there's value in kind of generating and kind of contributing to kind of wider accessibility for some of the ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also hearing you say something about, well, that like, I don't know, therapy, especially if we think about couples therapy, let's say like an hour and a half, 2 hours a week, and you're in there with a therapist. If you're in private practice, you're looking at a couple $100s. And then you're kind of there and then you leave, but that you kind of offered and created like some sort of resource that requires the couple to kind of be engaged pretty actively over time throughout the week or the month. Makes me think of like those, the idea that it takes 30 days to make or break a habit, and folks who
Mm-hmm.
do like 30-day challenges, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
exercise challenges, whatever, that like I can imagine if a couple did 30 days of reflexive practice, examining the relationship of power, social processes and discourse, the influence of culture on kind of like how we're making sense of the world, emotion, the emotions that come up. 30 days of a practice like that would create quite the robust relational dynamics, I imagine.
I would. That yes, that's a very helpful and interesting way to think about it. And I also think, realistically, a lot of people aren't going to engage with that kind of persistence, or it may be one partner in a heterosexual relationship. Maybe it's a female partner, or maybe both partners. Ideally, both partners would be engaged, but having a framework and some way to make sense of what's happening in my life and what's it go, even if it's how do I make sense of my relationship and my part in it, and then maybe more clarity if I need to, and more confidence to reach out and to say, I need you to come to therapy with me, or something like that. Yeah. So that's one area that I've been finding myself just really thinking about, kind of how do we help people collaboratively while still helping create essentially a new narrative, or it isn't so much a new narrative. I find it pretty. I ask all the couples that I've seen over the years, I tell them that I work from a model that mutually supports each partner, and I ask them if they agree with that. No one has ever said no. I think that even people who believe in a head of household model of therapy, I never have them, they may say, well, I don't think everything can be 50-50, or somebody may need to make decisions, but they don't say that they think the relationship shouldn't mutually support each of them.
Right.
And so I've been working with that idea for a long time of that people need to help envisioning what that would look like in practice. How could they do that?
Right.
The other piece, I don't know if we want to switch gears at all, but the other piece that I've been thinking about and struggling with, learning from failures, is just what it means to socioculturally attune to a client. And so that's the other piece that I've been working on recently.
All right, I want to ask about that because obviously I'm very drawn to what it means to socioculturally attune. But it's okay if I ask a quick question prior to that? Because something that I'm hearing you say, Carmen, is that like as you started to create this workbook, which I can account for my own challenges of when couples ask me for resources, I rarely have anything that I can offer. So I don't know, I'm appreciating what you're kind of putting out there. That said, if I'm hearing you right, you're kind of honoring that like a workbook for couples isn't necessarily new. You're kind of like jumping into an existing set of resources that exist, but that your particular line of questioning, I guess, to your workbook, to your point, isn't neutral, just like any line of questioning isn't neutral, and that in the ideas you're putting forward in the workbook, you're finding yourself, and correct me if I'm wrong here, kind of the political edge that you're privileging is attention to power, egalitarian relationships. Anything else that?
Yeah, I mean, so the book starts out by contextualizing, why is it that so many people's relationships don't work the way they want them, and the idea that people say they want mutually supportive relationships, but then it doesn't happen. And why does society make it so hard for us? So in a way, it's kind of like externalizing that. And then the first chapter helps people get in touch with their relational values and how our society tends to not value those. They give some lip service, but in the end, competition, assertiveness, all those kinds of independence are valued more in Western society, at least. Um, and then it creates the frame of people looking at how emotion is related, what they're feeling and experiencing is related to these larger discourses. And then, the chapters move into examining the flow of power in their relationship, and then each element of the circle of care, which is mutual vulnerability, mutual attunement, mutual influence, and shared relational responsibility. And then a final chapter on how to have difficult conversations and when things keep popping up again. And I really think that that's a new contribution to have people think about their relationship processes in that kind of contextual way, and then move into, well, what's happening in our relationship. So if they do follow through, as you suggested, immerse themselves in it for 30 days or however they do that, I think it's a significant intervention into the what people have hearing kind of in the larger world of relational discourse that's available to them.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I'm really appreciating this piece too, that I'm kind of interpreting that it's not about creating some abstracted version of what an equal relationship is. It's kind of imagining egalitarianness through, let me know if this is a fair capture, like a preferred set of power dynamics by both couples that honors mutual, what was the word? Mutual benefit.
Mutual support.
Mutual support. Thank you. That honors mutual support rather than like trying to like quantify a 50-50 dynamic, and rather kind of like set up qualifying behaviors and engagements and attunements and
Mm-hmm.
relational dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And bring that to the forefront. Like from a narrative perspective, these are not new ideas for people, but they are not thickened
Right.
in the larger discourse.
Right.
So people don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how to they know something's not right, but they don't necessarily know how to name it.
Yeah.
And have language for it. So I think it's a really helpful process. With talking about this with you, Naveed, makes me feel better about it, because the book isn't necessarily in the end saying you have to do everything just the way I'm suggesting that you do, but it is opening up ways for people to think and engage in things that may be very helpful to them, that even in traditional couple therapy is often not directly addressed, about how these in unintended inequalities in who does the caring work, yes, but also in how the emotion that people are experiencing that's driving their relationships and embodying their relationships from a kind of a more neurobiological perspective is related to the larger society, as opposed to it's inside them and then it just comes out. Right. I don't think there's a lot there to help people entertain this possible new way of thinking about emotion and relationships and mutuality.
Yeah, well, and in terms of the access it's creating, that's an important piece too, because like we said, couples counseling is extremely expensive and time consuming. But there's a lot of people, I'll say this anecdotally. I know a lot of folks who are now turning to like AI and other kind of like formats, like text-based formats to kind of address relational issues. And this feels like a kind of thoughtful, scholarly set of considerations that go beyond perhaps kind of like prescriptive behavioral models that don't maybe account for the complexities of people's lives.
Yes, and as you're saying that, I know you're aware that AFTA had a conference just a
Yes.
couple days ago on AI. And one of the themes was, the stuff that AI is going to give to people depends on what's out there.
Right.
And so that we need to be putting things out into the sort of knowledge base that AI models are coming to, so that they just don't parrot back individualistic kinds of overly self-oriented
Yes.
approaches to dealing with problems.
Right. And that's why it's like if I ever want a particular gift bought for me, I just say that word over and over again to my wife's phone, and then she starts getting ads for
Oh, yeah, that's true.
it.
That is true.
Using tech to my advantage. Um, but in seriousness, in the kind of time we have left, I wonder if it's okay if I do pivot us to the socioculturally attunement, and kind of like
Mhm.
what was coming up for you in that piece, especially in the context of AI. I wonder when AI would, I guess, if you could like lay out what is this phrase you're using and what, how have you come to like learn about it and implement it?
Well, that's an interesting question. What is sociocultural attunement? Um, I'm also co-author on a book that's used in a lot of family therapy programs now, called Socioculturally Attuned Family Therapy. And by that we mean that therapists bring kind of a third order thinking, where we are listening to what clients are presenting, and whatever model of therapy we're using, we're connecting the dots between individual and relational experience and larger societal contexts, especially including power. In socio-emotional relationship therapy, we more than some models really use this idea that the first thing therapists do is attune to the client's socio-emotional context. And what I've become aware of is that. So I've in the book I offer some really helpful, I think, guidelines for how to do that. Um, but I've had experiences with clients on both sides. Like, one side was a client. I was seeing this woman whose husband was an attorney. Uh, he was a Latino man who was an attorney, um, and they were from a fairly conservative religious background. She was not Latina, but I was seeing her, and I got. She finally consented to bring her husband in, and I worked so hard at attuning to him. And in this case, I actually was so successful that in the first 10 minutes, I brought him to tears. And that he experienced that as a power play on my part.
Like it kind of generated suspicion or
Well, at first, I didn't know what, I mean, like the way he presented it in the session is, you got me. So I had, like, we would probably tell anybody we're supervising, okay, you've been seeing this woman for a number of sessions. You got to come in and attune to the partner when he's joining the session.
Mhm.
So I had thought a lot about him. I was thinking about the dance, but he said, oh, you got me. And
Mm.
for him, not being vulnerable had been an important part. What I'd sort of missed in my attunement was that I needed that this is a relational process, and that attunement isn't just the therapist attuning to the client. The
Mm.
client also is attuning to us, right? And I think I had been seeing it as, and I think I occasionally talk about it that way in my writing, as though it's only the therapist who's doing the attuning. And I wasn't, um, acknowledging or actually paying attention to or crediting that he's he's attuning to me, and he's seeing my role as something that he has ideas about. He's bringing ideas, and we didn't talk about those things. I mean, I might with many other clients, but I didn't with that one. And I've recently been having conversations with Olga Smoliak. I don't know if you know her, but she's been holding me a little accountable about some of the things that I've written about sociocultural attunement, and making it sound like it's sort of a one-way thing where I'm attuning to the client and not realizing how their responses back are also attuning to me. Now, with this particular client, we got through that first session. I backed up a lot. I stopped being a little less emotional in the way I was tuning. But in the end, he told her that I must know what I'm doing because I had sort of captured his experience. And he came to some more sessions, but mostly we continued as individual therapy with her. So it wasn't all bad, but it wasn't what I was trying to have happen in the moment. But it did raise for me this larger question about, well, what really do we mean by socioculturally or socio-emotionally attuning to our clients?
Interesting. Oh gosh, there's so much to ask. And I guess what I'm just kind of understanding from your story, Carmen, and its richness is that as you were kind of like tuning in and like kind of putting forward the skill set that accompanies perhaps that attunement, like some of the active listening and paraphrasing kind of practice that you're in, that it kind of like landed in, maybe, I don't know this person, but like kind of landed in the world as perhaps framed as a competitive process where the vulnerable person is the loser and the person
Yes,
who gets the other person is the winner.
yes,
So
yes,
you, by his account, won,
I
made
won.
him the loser, but then your winning demonstrated also a skill set that you're actually very competent at this game
Yes,
called
so it was
relationships.
complex like that. And I don't think he wanted to engage with me particularly after that. But he was willing to. First of all, she'd been keeping it secret from him that she was coming to therapy, which, so it, as in many clinical interventions, even when we fail, we can often find something that's helpful or useful, or we just have to go forward from there. But yeah, you named it really. See, you understood also where he's coming from. Um, but I may also have missed other things that were important to him
Mm.
by putting my interpretation forward in a way that seemed like I was acting like we were connected, but I hadn't done the work of actually connecting with him first.
Let's do.
And in some ways, that's not fair to him, I think. Even if I'm right, which I guess I was, um, I was anticipating that he was going to be a difficult client from the things the wife had said. And you know how that goes when we hear only one side of the story.
Right. Yeah, and so I don't know if this is the right phrasing, but there's something perhaps about like as we're considering the relational process of attunement, that perhaps there's an extra impetus of responsibility in the therapist to be scaffolding the attunement process for the other person as well.
Yes, yes. And in things that I've been writing more recently, I've been trying to name that and in so doing remind myself, because I think, at least for me, it can, even though I keep talking about therapy being a relational process, I can behave or I can interact in ways where I am focusing more on the therapy skill that I'm doing and forgetting the relational part that's involved.
Oh my gosh, you have me very much in my own head about. I'm thinking about a case that I'm on right now with an Iraqi family, couples counseling, kind of high stakes in a lot of ways. And as an Iranian therapist, there's just very recent history between
Yeah.
Iranians and Iraqis, and it's less of, well, I'll say this here, but I'm sure someone listening will have a gripe with what I'm saying, so apologies in advance. But it sometimes that dynamic, the Iran-Iraq one, doesn't feel as much in like a power dynamic where there's one over the other. It just kind of like speaks to difficult histories in which
Yes,
different
yes.
things have
Uh-huh.
happened over time. So I like I don't know, this is how I'm taking some of what we've talked about, is that like sometimes the ideas of the socioculturally tuned therapist and the one-sidedness of it kind of assumes the therapist is constantly responding to their power,
Hmm.
but perhaps in the relational form of it, power, as you know, I think philosophically we're on the same page that it's like kind of fluid and flowing and changing. That
Hmm.
a therapist client that are attuned to each other might be able to together track these flows of power
Yes.
and histories rather than it all being the therapist and assuming what the client wants in that process.
Yes. And somehow I got caught in more than with most cases in this particular instance. And maybe I was trying to catch him in a way. I was anticipating that he was going to come with a high power, that he was going to put his power out there. And I think I was trying to make him vulnerable or a connect with his vulnerability.
Yeah.
Um, but even the act of doing that, uh, in some ways, was playing into this larger narrative that I had created my own story about, that he's going to want to take the power from me. So I'm going to be the therapist and I'm going to turn it in another direction. um,
Thank you for sharing that, Carmen, because that's such a familiar story of like clients, especially in relational work, when we get one story, how the other person's crafted, the anticipatory steps we take in preparing to meet with that person, and then how sometimes that feeds back into the broader narratives that we're protesting.
yeah. So that our role as socioculturally attuned therapists has to always be staying in really attentive to the relational processes that are going on, and that it's a two-way or multiple way, many way, if there's multiple people in session, or even, he was like in all our sessions when he wasn't physically there because she was always talking about him. um,
Right.
it's wonderfully interesting work that we do.
It is really fascinating. And I think, yeah, I hope if this person, if they're ever listening to this, can kind of appreciate how thoughtful you've been, were during, and continue to be after about that moment.
Yes, and maybe that's one of the important pieces about the broader model of approach to therapy that I keep trying to understand and teach better. Um, it it is that it's always an ongoing, unfolding process that we just don't know exactly how things are going to emerge. Um, but that we need to be accountable for our part in it.
Yes.
I mean, that's the part I keep trying to emphasize, is therapists being accountable for what they're bringing to the process and the conversation. And what we were discussing earlier about how, whether it's the workbook or articles, of what we're adding to the larger uh, societal discourses that people have available to them as they try to deal with the issues in their life.
Ah, beautifully said. Well, as always, thank you again for kind of joining us for this conversation, lending us your time. Thanks for your own vulnerability and kind of willingness to share stories of client work and kind of what brought you to developing this important resource. And so, just to kind of make sure as we're wrapping up here, Carmen, that where can folks kind of access some of these books?
Well, the books are available, as they say, wherever you get books, but they're published by Routledge, these last two. And so they're available through Routledge and, of course, in places like Amazon and such as well.
Yeah,
And I, I do find that the workbook, some instructors are starting to use it with their people in supervision or even beginning classes, because it's actually a very good way for therapists to bring self-awareness and start to develop another model of really understanding of relational perspective in the larger societal context.
You've got my wheels turning. I love this. All right. Thank you so much, Carmen. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you back soon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Naveed.